My name is Eleanor Voss, and for 11 years, my son called me by my first name like I was a stranger he had the misfortune of knowing. He didn't come up with that on his own. Nobody becomes that cold toward the woman who raised them without someone spending a long time teaching them how. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. I am 63 years old. I have weathered things that would have folded most people in half before they saw 40. I have rebuilt myself from nothing not once, but twice. And I have learned that the most dangerous kind of enemy is not the one who screams at you. It is the one who smiles at your son's wedding and whispers in his ear while the band plays. My son's father-in-law was exactly that kind of man. His name was Gerald Ashworth. He ran a mid-size construction company in Charlotte, North Carolina, the kind of operation that prints enough money to buy influence but stays small enough to avoid real scrutiny. He wore his wealth like a Sunday suit, pressed and visible, and he had spent his entire life arranging the world to his advantage. When his daughter brought my son home for the first time, I saw the way Gerald looked at me across the dinner table, not with warmth, not even with polite neutrality. He looked at me the way a chess player looks at a piece he has already decided to remove from the board. I should have paid closer attention to that look. My son and his wife had been married 2 years when Gerald made his move. I had been helping to manage the bookkeeping for a small catering business I co-owned with a friend. It wasn't much, just a modest operation we had built together over a decade, but it was ours. Gerald's company had contracted with us for a series of corporate events. The relationship seemed straightforward. Until it wasn't. I will not bore you with every legal detail. What I will tell you is that money disappeared from accounts I had access to, and the paperwork pointing to the theft had my signature on it. A signature I did not write. I sat in a lawyer's office and stared at those documents with my hands shaking, because even I could see how clean the forgery was. Whoever had done it had been careful. They had been patient, and they had known exactly where to aim. My co-owner settled out of court rather than fight. My name was attached to the loss. Gerald made sure every relevant person in that city heard about it. By the time the civil suit was finalized, my reputation had been burned down to ash. And my son, who had been listening to Gerald's version of events for months by then, looked at me across my own kitchen table and said, "I think you should give us some space." That was the last real conversation we had for 11 years. I want to tell you about the moment that broke me open, because you need to feel it to understand everything that came after. It was Mother's Day, 14 months after my son had asked me for space. I had spent the previous night writing him a letter, 4 handwritten pages, telling him about the forgery, about Gerald's timeline, about the things I had quietly started to piece together. I sealed it in an envelope and drove 40 minutes to leave it with his neighbor, a woman I had known since my son was in grade school, who promised to hand-deliver it. 3 weeks later, that same envelope appeared in my mailbox. Unopened, my own handwriting on the front. A sticky note in my son's hand, "Please stop." I sat in my car in my own driveway and held that envelope for a long time. The sun went down. The streetlights came on. I didn't move. If you have ever held something you made with love and had it handed back to you unopened, you know there are no words for that particular kind of grief. It isn't loud. It sits in your chest like a stone that never fully dissolves. I carried it every day from that point forward, and eventually, I learned to use its weight as ballast instead of burden. I left Charlotte. There was nothing left for me there except whispers and Gerald's satisfied silence. I drove to Raleigh with 2 suitcases, a car that needed new brake pads, and a storage unit worth of furniture I couldn't afford to move. I rented a room in a house shared with 2 women I had never met. One was a nursing student. The other worked nights at a distribution center. We were polite to each other in the kitchen and stayed out of each other's way the rest of the time. It was the smallest my life had ever been, and I told myself every morning that small was not the same as finished. I had spent years managing bookkeeping, so numbers were the one tool no one had been able to take from me. I found contract work quickly, remote accounting for small businesses that couldn't afford a full-time hire. I worked from a folding table in my bedroom with a second-hand laptop and a phone that cut out whenever it rained. I billed 40, sometimes 50 hours a week and spent almost nothing. I ate oatmeal and rotisserie chicken and whatever was on sale at the grocery store closest to the bus stop. I did not buy coffee. I did not go to the movies. I did not let myself grieve on weekdays. At night, after my work was done, I studied. I had always been curious about real estate, but had never had the time or the capital to explore it seriously. Now I had the time, and I was acquiring the capital one careful dollar at a time. I read every book I could find on property investment. I took an online course. I joined a forum of small landlords and asked questions and absorbed every answer. I failed a practice licensing exam the first time and passed it by 42 points the second. Within 18 months of arriving in Raleigh, I had saved enough for a down payment on a 2-unit property in a neighborhood everyone else had written off. I fixed the water damage myself, watching YouTube tutorials at midnight. I painted every wall. I replaced the kitchen fixtures. I listed the upstairs unit for rent and had a tenant signed within 9 days. That first rent check was $875. I cried over it like it was a miracle, because it was. Property by property, I climbed. I was methodical in a way that grief teaches you to be. I did not rush. I did not celebrate prematurely. I researched every purchase 3 times and negotiated like I had nothing to prove, which is, paradoxically, the most powerful negotiating position there is. I moved through markets nobody was watching yet. I bought ugly houses on good streets and made them beautiful. I bought land people thought was worthless and waited. By the time I turned 57, I had 31 units across 4 counties and a portfolio that my accountant told me had exceeded the category of hobby investment. I laughed when she said that. She didn't know the half of it. I kept my name out of everything I could. Properties held in LLCs. Business dealings done through a management company no one would think to connect to Eleanor Voss, the disgraced bookkeeper from Charlotte. I lived modestly by choice, not necessity. I drove a clean but unremarkable car. I shopped at the same grocery store. My neighbors knew me as the quiet woman in the corner house who kept her yard tidy and waved hello from the driveway. But I watched. I always watched. I had kept a careful distance from Charlotte for years, but I had not stopped paying attention to what happened there. I had a friend, a woman I had known since my son was a toddler, who still lived 2 streets over from where my son and his wife had built their life. She didn't volunteer information, but she answered when I asked. I learned that my daughter-in-law had a talent for interior design and had been slowly building a boutique home furnishings business. I learned that Gerald had helped fund it. I learned that my son was proud of her in the way that good husbands are, visibly, publicly, in the way he had never quite been proud of me. I learned, through channels I will not fully describe, that my daughter-in-law's business had grown enough that she was planning to open a flagship showroom in Charlotte's Uptown district. A grand opening, invitations, press. A moment for the Ashworth family to stand together and take credit for everything they had built. I also learned, 2 months before that grand opening, that the commercial property where the showroom was being built had recently changed hands. I had bought it quietly through 3 layers of holding companies. The building was gorgeous, exactly the kind of space that photographs well for press releases. I had been planning to lease it to a regional furniture company. Instead, when I learned who wanted that space, I waited. My daughter-in-law's team negotiated the lease with my property management company. They never knew who owned the building. Why would they? Eleanor Voss was a ghost in their story. Just a name attached to old trouble that Gerald had long since resolved to his satisfaction. The lease was signed, the showroom was built, the invitations went out, and one arrived, addressed to me. I stood in my kitchen holding that cream-colored envelope with my son's return address, and I felt something I had not expected. Not triumph, not anger, something quieter. The particular stillness of a person who has been waiting for a door to open and suddenly hears the latch click. The invitation was not warm. There was no handwritten note, no call beforehand. My daughter-in-law had apparently insisted on inviting me as a gesture of goodwill. My son had agreed in that reluctant way people agree to things when they don't want to seem petty. Neither of them expected me to come. I called my son for the first time in 4 years. He answered on the 3rd ring, sounding like a man bracing for something unpleasant. "I'll be there," I said. "Thank you for including me." A pause. Then, flatly, "Sure, Mom." He said Mom. It was the first time in years. I don't think he noticed. I filed it away like something precious. I had 6 weeks to prepare. I was not preparing out of vanity. I was preparing the way a person prepares when they understand that some moments only happen once, and you owe it to yourself to meet them fully. I made one call to arrange a car. Not just any car, a Rolls-Royce Phantom in deep pearl white, the kind of vehicle that doesn't announce itself with noise but with presence. I had driven past the dealership in Raleigh 100 times and never stopped. This time, I walked in, sat down, and wrote the check. I found a tailor I had been referred to by a client, a woman who understood that clothing for a certain kind of occasion is not decoration but armor. I chose a dress in deep burgundy with a structured silhouette, understated jewelry, heels that were elegant rather than aggressive. Everything said the same thing: I am exactly where I am supposed to be. The morning of the grand opening, I sat at my kitchen table and opened the drawer where I keep the things I rarely look at. In the back, behind some papers, was the envelope my son had returned to me unopened 11 years ago, my handwriting on the front, his sticky note still attached. I held it for a moment, then I set it back in the drawer and closed it gently. That chapter had been written. Today I was writing a different one. The drive to Charlotte took just under 2.5 hours. I sat in the back of that Phantom and watched the landscape shift from familiar Raleigh neighborhoods to the outskirts of a city that had once held everything I loved. I did not feel nostalgic. I felt precise. The showroom was in a building I knew better than anyone in that room would realize. I knew the load-bearing walls. I knew the ceiling height in the main gallery. I knew that the east-facing windows threw gold light in the late afternoon, which was exactly when the event was scheduled. The car slowed as we approached. Even from the street, I could see the cluster of guests on the sidewalk, the catering staff in white linen, the photographer moving along the edges of the crowd. My driver opened the door and I stepped out. The first thing I heard was silence. Not total silence, but the kind that spreads through a crowd when something happens that people haven't prepared a reaction for. A woman in a pearl-white Rolls-Royce, stepping out alone, moving with the unhurried certainty of someone who has arrived exactly on time. I saw my son before he saw me. He was standing near the entrance talking to one of Gerald's associates, a glass in his hand, laughing at something. He turned when someone touched his arm and pointed. I watched his face change. It wasn't the dramatic collapse of a man who expected a ghost and got a force of nature. It was something more interior than that, and in some ways more revealing. The laughter drained out first, then the color shifted, then his hand, the one holding the glass, went very still. He stared at me the way you stare at something you have convinced yourself doesn't exist when it appears in the room. Gerald was 6 feet to my son's left. He saw me a half-second later, and his reaction was the one I had actually come to see. His jaw tightened. His eyes did the rapid calculation of a man who has spent decades managing outcomes, suddenly confronting an outcome he did not arrange. He looked from me to the car and back to me, and in that look I saw something I had waited a long time to see. Not fear exactly. Recognition. The recognition of a man who understands, for the first time, that the game has been running longer than he knew, and he is not the one who ends it. My daughter-in-law came forward with the gracious energy of a woman who has worked hard to build something and wants this day to go well. She extended her hand with a professional smile, warm but careful. "Eleanor, I'm so glad you came. The space is beautiful," I said, and I meant it. My space, my building, beautiful because I had chosen it to be. She thanked me and gestured inside. I walked in slowly, letting my eyes move over the room. The styling was genuinely lovely. She had real talent. I had always suspected that was true, back in the years when I still got to observe her from up close. I mingled. I spoke to people I didn't know, who didn't know me, and who therefore saw me with entirely fresh eyes. An architect who asked which firm I worked with. A woman from a local business journal who asked for my card. I gave her one. My management company's card. The one with the address that matched the building we were standing in. She looked at it, and then back at me with a small, curious tilt of her head. "Are you the property owner?" she asked. "I am," I said pleasantly. My son was close enough to hear that exchange. I watched it land. Gerald came to me himself, which I had expected. He was too practiced to make a scene, and too proud to avoid the conversation entirely. He approached with the forced ease of a man who has never had to do anything the hard way. Eleanor. His voice was smooth, measured. It's been a long time. It has, I said. You look well. I am well, Gerald. Better than you might have expected, I imagine. Something shifted behind his eyes. This is a big day for the family. It is, I agreed. I'm glad to be part of it. The double meaning hung between us. He understood it. I could see him understanding it, filing through the implications, arriving at the part where he realized his daughter's flagship showroom was housed in a building owned by the woman he had spent a decade trying to erase. I watched him absorb that and decide, as men like Gerald always decide, that control requires composure. He excused himself with a nod and walked back to his cluster of associates. I turned back to the room. The business journalist found me again an hour later, this time with a small recorder and a set of direct questions. She had done a quick search on her phone, she said. She had found some interesting connections between the property ownership and a holding company tied to my name. Was I planning to expand my portfolio further in Charlotte? I was. I told her as much. I told her I had been quietly acquiring properties in several North Carolina markets for over a decade. I told her that this particular building had been a deliberate choice. I kept my voice warm and level throughout. I said nothing unkind. I did not need to. My son found me as the event began to wind down. The crowd had thinned enough that our conversation could be private without being conspicuous. He came to stand beside me near one of the tall windows, and for a moment neither of us spoke. We looked out at the street. You own the building, he said finally. Not a question. I do. Another silence. I let it rest there. I had learned, in the years of rebuilding myself, that the most powerful thing you can do in a conversation is refuse to fill every pause. I didn't know, he said. I know you didn't. He turned to look at me then, and I saw something in his face that I had not seen in so long I had almost forgotten what it looked like. Uncertainty. The particular uncertainty of a person whose understanding of the past is quietly rearranging itself. How long? He asked. How long have you been doing this? Since I left Charlotte, I said. About 11 years. He absorbed that. 11 years is the same number of years he had called me by my first name. I did not point that out. He was already doing the arithmetic himself. Mom, I don't need anything from you, I said quietly. There was no edge in my voice. I want you to understand that. I was not cold. I was not punishing him. I was simply telling him the truth in the way that only becomes possible after you have stopped needing it to land a particular way. I don't need an apology. I don't need you to believe me about Gerald. I built my life without any of that, and it's a good life. I'm proud of it. His jaw moved. I sent that letter back. I know. I was. He stopped. Tried again. I was wrong. I looked at my son for a long moment. He was in his early 40s now. There were things in his face that hadn't been there when I last knew him well, the kind of weight that accumulates from living, from making choices and carrying them. He looked like a man who had been quietly uncomfortable for a long time and was only just beginning to understand why. That's between you and yourself, I said gently. Not between you and me. He flinched. Not from cruelty. From accuracy. Gerald came to find his daughter before I could make my way to say goodbye. I watched him cross the room toward her, his hand going to her shoulder in a proprietary gesture, his eyes tracking me over her head. I smiled at him. Just a smile. The smile of a woman who holds the deed to the ground he was standing on. I found my daughter-in-law near the entrance as I was leaving. She was talking to her photographer and turned when she heard my heels on the marble. Thank you for the invitation, I said. Your eye for space is extraordinary. This room suits you. She thanked me, and there was something unguarded in it, the gratitude of someone receiving a compliment they weren't quite expecting and don't know how to deflect. I held her hand briefly, the way women do when words aren't quite enough, and then I let go. I walked out through the front door of my building into the early evening air. The Phantom was waiting. My driver opened the door and I got in without looking back. On the drive home, I sat with my hands folded in my lap and watched Charlotte recede through the rear window. The skyline that had once held my whole life, my marriage, my son's childhood, my humiliation, grew smaller and then disappeared. I did not feel victorious in the loud way I had once imagined I might. What I felt was something closer to completion, like the last piece of a sentence settling into place. For 11 years I had been the woman Gerald Ashworth framed and erased, the woman whose own son returned her letters unopened, the woman who had left a city in 2 suitcases with nothing but her capability and her rage and her refusal to accept that the story was finished. I had never gone back to fight. I had never made accusations or mounted campaigns. I had never needed to. I had simply built, in the silence they thought was defeat, something so large and so quietly powerful that when the moment came, I didn't have to raise my voice. The journalist's article ran 4 days later. It was mostly about my real estate portfolio, framed as a profile of an under-the-radar investor who had spent a decade reshaping property markets across central North Carolina. There was a quote from me near the end, something I had said almost offhandedly, that she had apparently found worth printing. I learned early that the people who think they've buried you are counting on you to stay buried. I just never saw the point in cooperating with that. My son called me the morning the article was published. I let it ring twice before I answered. "I read it," he said. "Okay." A long pause. I could hear him breathing, deciding. "I'd like to have coffee with you sometime, if you're ever in Charlotte." I was quiet for a moment. 11 years of silence lives in a moment like that. The unopened envelope, the sticky note, the slow, careful work of turning nothing into something while the people who were supposed to love you assumed you had simply disappeared. "I'll let you know when I'm in town," I said. It was not a door slamming. It was not a door flying open either. It was something more honest than both of those things. A door standing ajar, with neither of us quite sure yet who should be the one to walk through it first. I set the phone down and poured myself a second cup of coffee and stood at my kitchen window looking out at the yard. The azaleas I had planted last spring were just starting to come in, pink and insistent along the back fence. They had called me disgraced. They had called me finished. They had handed my own letters back unopened and told their version of my life to anyone willing to listen. And here I stood in a house I owned, in a city I had chosen, with a portfolio that stretched across 4 counties and a name that the business press had just printed next to words like quiet power and long game. I hadn't come back to prove anything to Gerald. I hadn't come back to save my relationship with my son or undo what he had done or reclaim anything that was lost. I had come back because I built something worth showing up for. And I had shown up. That was enough. That would always be enough. The woman they tried to bury was still here, and she had spent 11 years building something that even silence couldn't take from her. Not wretched, not erased, not finished, just patient. And patience, I had learned, is only indistinguishable from defeat until the moment it isn't.